Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, residents visited the exclusion zone to feed or rescue animals left behind, and some reported that the visit made them ill. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 14, The Feds. Where was the EPA? The EPA responded to Alberton under the emergency provisions of the Superfund law. Federal agencies responded to a major spill of a reportable chemical, as well as to one that impacted federal property. In this case, both the railroad on federal right-of-way and the interstate highway had been shut down. Additionally, if there is imminent and substantial endangerment to public health or the environment, then we have authority, the EPA's Chris Weiss explained. The EPA held primacy over Superfund actions on dry land and the U.S. Coast Guard on waterways. Concerned about the Clark Fork River, the EPA called in the U.S. Coast Guard Pacific Strike Team out of California to help. On April 11, the EPA dispatched two on-scene coordinators, OSCs, Tian Nguyen and Mike Zimmerman, along with Superfund Technical Assessment and Response Team members, START. They arrived in the afternoon from Region 8 headquarters in Denver. The EPA initially planned on air monitoring, and the Coast Guard would provide safety oversight within the hot zone and other technical assistance. That morning, toxicologist Weiss provided advice and support to local hospitals by phone. But April 12 logs tersely documented an apparent distrust of the EPA by local and state officials. Tim Murphy of the State Emergency Response Commission warned I.C. Waldron that the EPA, quote, could be political. The text noted, EPA personnel have been at the 9 Mile command post asking questions. Publicly, the EPA was invisible, with no mention in the media the first few days. Behind the scenes, the agency was spoon-fed information on the sidelines. The EPA was not a wanted partner. While the media was escorted to the I-90 viewing site on April 11, the EPA only made it as far as the 9 Mile command post. On Saturday, April 13, the EPA and Coast Guard were finally escorted to the viewing site on I-90. Neither had yet visited the spill site. Even from afar, they didn't like what they saw. Workers without protection. When activist residents saw the EPA START report the following winter, suspicions flared. The report said without explanation that the EPA and U.S. Coast Guard were, quote, denied access to the hot zone until April 14. Elsewhere, START said that until April 14, EPA's and START's assistance was not requested by the state of Montana and MRL within the wreckage area of the hot zone. Was the EPA actively shut out or a timid bystander awaiting an invitation? In fact, both reports were related. The state of Montana apparently recruited willing locals in denying the feds. Was such obstruction in the best interest of public health and safety? Some residents wondered, what was MRL hiding? Tom Ziegler recalled a big meeting soon after the feds observed MRL contractors without respiratory protection. The Coast Guard's Lieutenant Kimber Bannon had complained to Ziegler back at the command post. She wanted to know who the people were down at the hot zone, walking around with no protective gear on, just a hard hat on, Ziegler said. I said, ma'am, those are MRL people and we have no control over them. It's their site, it's their incident. Well, they need to get out of there, she replied. Discussion revolved around site safety at the IC briefing with members of the tech group, attended by the Coast Guard and EPA, including lead OSC Nguyen. MTEC's Charlie Cook, MRL's Site Health and Safety Officer, now warned, no one goes inside red zone area without PPE. All personnel will be relieved of their duties if they violate this rule. But Nguyen still had concerns that you are working at level D without protection, he said. Cook, the problem has been addressed. Nguyen pressed on, having also seen a videotape showing unprotected workers. Nguyen, you can't justify the highway being closed if you're working under these level D conditions. A blue plume of caustic fumes was witnessed from across the highway at 12:30 p.m. and unprotected people in the area. A blue plume of caustic fumes did not indicate chlorine. Nguyen later only recalled he had been concerned about workers' exposure to chlorine. Lieutenant Bannon of the U.S. Coast Guard added, we could smell chlorine at our observation point on the highway across the river. Cook said unprotected workers was possible on the first day, This is no longer happening, he said. B.J. McComb, Ziegler, Mineral County Commissioner Charlie Rock, and the feds all witnessed unprotected workers April 11, 12, and 13. Ziegler recalled of the meeting's outcome, "We actually made an organizational chart of the incident and who's going to do what. And the Coast Guard could have taken over, but they didn't. They said they would be a technical advisor. And MRL was in charge. They had some specialists coming out that knew about the tank cars." But so far, MRL's expert operations were getting amateur ratings. After the meeting, Cook signed off on a safety program for Georgia Pacific in compliance with OSHA regulations. All workers were to have hazmat training and wear PPE as required. The techs also formalized safety zones and restrictions. The hot zone core now included a yellow and red zone. The red zone was established within approximately 100 feet around the chlorine cars where SCBA was required. The yellow zone encompassed the red zone within approximately 300 feet and required APR, air purifying respirators. Later, the red and yellow zones were considered dynamic because of shifting chlorine levels and wind direction. Beyond the yellow zone to the edge of the broad hot zone, such as near the Natural Pier Bridge, personnel needed to carry an emergency filter respirator. On day 3, the EPA helped enforce basic safety protocols for site workers. Locals stonewalled the feds from the start. Ziegler recalled some of the attitude. "I know there was a lot of headbanging going on. Whose jurisdiction? I know that Chief Waldron, it was his thing, and I know that there was a big conflict with a lot of people." The Missoula Health Department's Chris Sircone recalled, "I think Scott Waldron felt that if the EPA were involved, that it would be outside all of his control, and he wouldn't play as much a role. I mean, those guys, they train for this stuff all the time, and when something happens, it's like exciting to them." But Ben Schmidt of the Health Department thought MRL wanted control. Lieutenant Mike McMeekin didn't work the incident until that Saturday, never met the EPA's Tien Nguyen, and wasn't at any meetings Nguyen attended. Nevertheless, he formed a strong opinion and claimed personality conflicts. Tien came in and decided that he was in charge of everything, McMeekin said. And that was the end of the story, because he represented the federal government, and that doesn't work. Tellingly, though, McMeekin got that impression completely secondhand, he said, by multiple sources he didn't recall. The record reflected that locals had an attitude from the start, and that MRL and Waldron actively denied the EPA access to the site. The only documented conflict with Nguyen came when he had finally been allowed to view the site, and his criticisms of unprotected workers were warranted. Nobody had wanted the feds on the team in the first place. The EPA arrived at the command post in the early evening April 11. Nguyen requested a site visit through I.C. Waldron. He claimed because of the safety reason he could not let the EPA team go to visit the site, Nguyen recalled. Nguyen, originally from Vietnam, spoke with an accent. The EPA members, trained to respond to a major chemical release, were certified in Level A PPE and brought their own equipment. "We're the ones that train firefighters," Chris Weiss later decried. "Their hazmat training comes through the federal government, through the EPA, to them." The EPA had participated in the 1995 worst-case scenario held at Stone Container, helping train Waldron and other locals. Safety reasons was an ironic excuse in light of the lax safety protocol at the site. Even the media had been escorted to the I-90 viewpoint on April 11, while the EPA was kept leashed back at 9 Mile. The EPA had the authority to go to the spill site, but we needed to work with the local authority, Waldron. "If they are willing to take a lead, then we support them as technical advisor or support them with any technical support that they requested," Nguyen said, "unless the EPA thinks that they cannot do their job, the way the EPA thinks it's advised. Then we can take over." If the primary responsible party, MRL, was willing to respond to the cleanup, most of the time, he said, the EPA let them do that. "Ideally," Nguyen explained, "the incident commander is supposed to work with me and let my team get to the site right away, so we can get a first-hand evaluation about the situation and have a chance to discuss with the incident commander and also Montana Rail Link about how to respond, including air monitoring or protective clothing, or how to contain the chlorine release." We got resistance from them to access the site for the first day and a half, but we tried our best to work with them. Nguyen had never encountered anything like this in an emergency situation. As a sort of compromise, he said, His team was shown a videotape of the site taken from a distance. That tape gave him his first evidence that workers were not being properly protected. Wynne pressed Waldron all day, Friday the 12th. Finally, they agreed to let us go to visit the site across from the river, he said, the morning of April 13. Contrary to throwing his weight around, Wynne appeared to show considerable patience. Until day 3, the EPA could do little but gather information secondhand and sit on their expert hands. At the early evacuee meetings, the EPA was excluded from the panel. At first, they just treat us like media people, Wynne said, and just informed us as to what's going on. But I resisted to that. I wanted to get involved with the incident command. That means I can sit in on the meetings and discuss what's going on. Wynne was hesitant to assert statutory authority. He really needed the cooperation of locals. Secondly, he said, I've heard of some situations in the past if the OSCs have come and tried to take over and some local authority tried to arrest the OSC. Wynne thought Waldron might attempt to order such action. Frustrated, Wynne turned to Montana officials. I tried to work with the state level, and I think the state did not request the EPA to come to the site. The START report was correct, if vague on reasons. Denied access by locals and not requested to visit the site by the state. The message was the same. Keep out. Wynne said Jim Green of the Montana Department of Emergency Services was in Frenchtown. I tried to work with him so he can convince Waldron to let the EPA get more involved in the situation. I'm not sure, Wynne said, but my opinion, I don't think he was the first person that convinced the local authority to let EPA visit the site. Instead, Wynne thought, Waldron wanted to use Jim Green as a liaison between me and Incident Commander, a buffer. Fed information by IC, the EPA had no idea how much potassium cressolate had spilled or the proximity to the leaking chlorine. If Wynne had seen the ruptured tanks, would he have been concerned about a reaction between the chemicals? Any time when we see two different chemicals spill and sit next together, our most concern of reactions if something happened. And we have to check for that, for sure. After the emergency safety meeting, Wynne said, finally, the Frenchtown fire chief agreed to let the EPA team visit the site. Wynne never did. On standby for emergency response, he left the incident the next day, replaced by OSC Steve Way. As the text put it, we have negotiated an entry plan for the NTSB, the EPA, and the Coast Guard. But it wasn't supposed to be a negotiation. It was supposed to be about doing what was best for public safety, not about personal egos or petty politics, not to mention complying with federal law. Instead of getting things done, Wynne said he spent most of his time negotiating. I never had that situation before, he said, and he never heard of locals totally shutting down the EPA team like this case from the beginning. Had Wynne thought Waldron was really in charge, or that MRL had been directing Incident Command? It's tough to say, he said, but officially it looked like Incident Commander in charge. But you know, a lot of time, whomever have money in charge. Why did IC Scott Waldron exclude the EPA? Waldron: at the time, initially, in the first few days after the release, we were overwhelmed with federal and state agencies that all wanted to be somewhere, and most of them had little jurisdictional authority, and a lot of them had no jurisdictional authority, and I don't recall the specifics on this situation, but I know that at some point I just kind of said, look guys, you can stay out until we get a handle on. We were trying to get a handle on what all was going on. A lot of that was just based on being able to manage the scene. I don't recall now who the first person from OSHA was. Elsewhere, Waldron confused the EPA representative as being from FEMA. Waldron continued, I don't recall why it's specific to that. I don't recall at this time. I know it was, if we had let everybody in that thought they had a right to go look, we'd have had thousands of people in there. Now, that's a little overstatement, but we'd have had way too many people in there, and we still didn't have a handle on exactly what we were doing, so that was, I think, the primary reason. Waldron didn't recall a specific personality conflict with Wynne as suggested by others. Waldron denied anyone tried to stonewall the EPA. I don't recall any specifics about we want to keep them out for some purpose. I don't believe that occurred. I don't think you need to read anything into the fact that we kept somebody out or somebody didn't get along with somebody. Those are tough situations. You had I think in general, a lot of people trying to do the right thing. Just very complex, trying to get them all working together. And it takes a few days to get that organized. This was a very complex situation with lots of technical issues, and I do not believe that Montana Rail Link wanted them out for any specific reason, if the insinuation is so that they didn't find something, or anything like that. That's inaccurate. Waldron said Unified Command made the final decision in these matters, despite the log suggesting MRL's techs had site control. And MRL was on the Unified Command. Within a week, Waldron would tell county officials, if this would have happened 50 miles further north, EPA would have brought in their own strike team to handle the incident, an admission of EPA authority and competence that was strikingly missing from Waldron and others in the early days of the spill. Waldron's vague explanation boiled down to being too busy and overwhelmed to allow the federal agencies to do their jobs and help. By the record, MRL and its techs were mainly in charge. In deposition, MRL President William Brodsky implied that MRL was in charge. Brodsky said he appointed Dan Watts as project coordinator for the site, and MRL's technical group oversaw the chlorine. Scott Waldron ran the field operation, quote, for us, responsible for non-technical needs. Dan Watts originally claimed in court that Unified Command made all decisions, not MRL. But as to who restricted EPA access, Watts finally admitted he and the techs made the decision. MRL wanted to deny access to the feds, and Waldron complied. With their stonewalling, MRL initially took matters out of EPA's hands. One important reason for EPA control, in the past, corporations had withheld or even doctored lab results. But while the EPA wrangled with MRL and locals, some locals felt chafed over MRL as well. Jess Mickelson pointed to MRL doing their own thing and withholding information. He called the corporate stance pretty common because they look at us as a threat. Whatever we do is likely to cause them some impact. Mickelson claimed that when the EPA replacements came on board, they gave MRL a warning to quit being cowboys or arrests would be made. Part of the problem was also Waldron, Mickelson said. He was aligned with MRL until he realized it was the wrong side of the fence to be on, and then he quickly changed sides to what was beneficial to him. That's normal practice, what Scott did, play every angle that he could to his advantage. And I don't totally want you to think that I dislike Scott, because I had worked with him many times, and in the right situation, he was a pretty good incident commander, did a good job. But sometimes his ego just got in the way. The media, including the Missoulian, never reported a word about the denial of access for the EPA. Consequently, the public likely assumed the EPA exercised oversight from the beginning. Spill victims who much later became aware of the stonewalling of the EPA grew instantly suspicious, especially in light of other perceived withholdings of information. The stonewalling appeared nefarious. While the EPA was denied access, Frenchtown fireman Paul Manson said he took 2 FRA agents out to the site he thought on April 12th. Men from the Federal Railroad Administration. We came in from the Sear exit, Manson said. They took a frontage road, and then we ended up walking into it. I took a bunch of pictures of the chlorine car. Waldron ordered Manson to bring the agents in. I think they were looking to see if something had fallen off the train and caused it to derail. They were looking at ties, Manson said. Manson's pictures showed that as the men passed along the train from the west, vegetation was discolored and killed in the south ditch. Manson recalled, that potassium crestlate went into the borrow pit over there and it just disappeared. It went into the groundwater, he assumed. It smelled like cleaner. Manson took one photo from Reardon Lane across from the tanks, the spot where Ziegler had shot video earlier. A haze rose above the tanks. One of the FRA men, Manson recalled, crawls up on top of the wreck. He crawled up on top to look and I says, if something happens, I'm leaving your ass there. The FRA men had no protective gear. The only one who had SCBA was me, Manson said, at the ready. They also had no meters. No, Manson said, they just wanted to see the wreck. I'm pretty sure what they were looking for was something that caused the train to derail. They spent maybe an hour there. One thing that caught their eye was a tarp at the end of the deck of a rail car, the sort someone who had hopped a train might use. While the hazmat-certified EPA was denied access to the site, Waldron had directed Manson to briefly take the non-certified FRA agents in without protection. For the FRA, getting to the site had a special imperative. Weiss. At that time, we didn't know if we were dealing with a crime or not yet. there was some concern that the train may have been purposely derailed, and the people responsible for determining that couldn't get into the site because they didn't have hazmat training, the FRA investigators. Ken Holgard of the FRA said he went in escorted, possibly with Manson or on a separate trip. He recalled they drove west past the site, then turned around, and we walked into the site on the rail side, he said, looking for maybe what caused it, and got within a couple 100 feet of the cars. He wore no protective gear, but said they had chlorine monitors and walked from the west, upwind. We were protected, he said. He couldn't go any closer due to the FRA's policy of not going into a hot zone, which here apparently referred to the text tape barrier red zone. I don't think there was much smoke, Holgard said. No, I think there was a few pockets, some kind of smoke. Not a lot, not a big fire or anything like that. Any smoke was possibly a chemical reaction. Holgard described the potassium cresslate as black, ugly-smelling stuff. Holgard's account suggested that no federal agent had yet got very close to the point of derailment. Dave Watson of the NTSB also sought access to the site. Holgard said, Watson, he could go in because his agency allows him to. Watson was level A certified. But Watson didn't go in when he wanted to. A rumor later floated that Watson had initially been kept out. Holgard, they kind of talked Dave out of it because all he had to do was show his badge and he could have gone in. But they talked him out of going in. At some point, the FRA's Lee Klaus said he went to the site with Watson and MRL's Joe Richardson, with Richardson monitoring for chlorine. Unprotected, after an hour, Klaus felt he was getting pretty high and left the site. Late on April 13, after negotiations, IC announced that the EPA and NTSB will go to the site on Sunday morning for observation, possibly when Watson and Klaus went in. Finally, the EPA was on the verge of their first access to the site, just as residents living east of Petty Creek were about to come home. On April 14, EPA Steve Way and Chris Weiss relieved Wynn and Zimmerman. They hoped the incident would be over in a few days. The new OSC Way, with an environmental science and engineering background, had been with the EPA since 1984. Weiss was a board-certified toxicologist with EPA Region 8 and had been advising Ellen Leahy by phone about health aspects of the spill. Weiss often paired with Way in responses. Hardly their first dance, but their first chlorine spill, and the steps would be unique and complicated. The Office of Inspector General later said Way was able to clear the air with the incident commander, Montana Rail Link, and the state of Montana's Department of Emergency Management Services. OIG reported that local authorities misunderstood EPA's role, for example, regulatory versus response activities. Another excuse was that state officials wanted EPA to tread lightly because at the time of the incident, federal agents were in the area looking for the Unabomber. But the Unabomber was arrested the week prior to the spill. Way did not negotiate. When I got there, I just basically said, I'm going to do an entry. I'm going to go on scene. And you guys better be ready if you want to go with me because we're going in. And I didn't really ask their permission. I just told them that's what I'm going to do. And this is what our authorities are to do so, and explain that's how it's going to be. Way denied having to make threat of arrests, and neither local officials nor MRL challenged him. As OSC, Way's job was overseeing the EPA's response, as well as what the company is doing, the railroad and the chlorine industry, he said, to make sure that it's being done safely, the public is being protected, and making sure information is flowing to the public and local decision makers to manage an incident like that. Weiss served as Way's principal scientific advisor and would coordinate on-scene scientific activity such as air monitoring, reviewing evacuation zones, and overseeing sampling and testing for contaminants. His role boiled down to assessing the hazards of the spill and the risks involved to safeguard public health at the site and in the surrounding community. Until now, such oversight had been obstructed. Weiss, we can let the responsible party spend their money if they're doing a good job. If they're not, we can take over and spend federal dollars to make sure that public health and the environment is protected. The OSC was authorized to spend perhaps a couple $1 million. And then, Weiss said, we sue them for compensation. With MRL, the EPA did not have to bring down the hammer. If they hadn't worked with us, he said, we would have had to call in more resources. It became clear that they were both skilled and willing to work with us, so that was a relief. They were already on site. I began to bring them together with our team. MRL spent a tremendous amount of energy and money bringing in highly skilled teams of chlorine experts and environmental folks, Weiss said. We watched them on an hour-by-hour basis, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But our opinion was, with a few exceptions, they were doing a very good job of both protecting the environment and moving the site cleanup along. As good or better than we could have done. But the cooperation of MRL and the oversight by the EPA did not begin until over 72 hours into the incident. 19 years after the derailment, some light shone on the murky denial of the feds. In May of 2015, Jim Green of the Montana Department of Emergency Services and Tim Murphy of the Montana Department of Natural Resource Conservation and the State Emergency Response Commission talked to state responders during a staff ride on the Alberton spill, an instructional exercise meant to teach others about the Incident Command System. On April 11, 1996, Governor Mark Roscoe called a state of emergency. Murphy recalled, "Jim called me, and with my hat on as the State Emergency Response Commission, Jim and the governor wanted me to be that focal point. So within a few minutes, I got a call from the governor. The governor had one objective: don't let the feds take this over." So that's pretty simple. So the next morning, Dan Watts, who was in the Unified Command with Scott Waldron, called Paul Lazy, who was the plans chief on the local team, and myself, and we went down to MRL's headquarters, Washington Corporation's headquarters, and we gave a briefing to Governor Roscoe and Dennis Washington, who was the president of Washington Corporation. After that briefing, the governor and Dennis asked us to excuse ourselves, and they would call us back in. So in less than 10 minutes, we were called back in. And we were told by Dennis Washington that Washington Corporation was going to pay for this big bad deal. And we were told by the governor again, don't let the feds take this over. So about the same time, EPA from Denver showed up with the West Coast Strike Team of the Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard is also the entity that EPA uses as their technical incident command system experts. So the Coast Guard fell beneath Tien Nguyen's authority, and he had the code of Federal Register, and he pulled that out, and he showed everybody that when you've got a hazmat deal, EPA can take it over. And oh, by the way, EPA wanted to take this over. So who's your bosses? You've got a charge from the governor, you've got a checkbook from Dennis Washington, and you've got the EPA on the ground with the U.S. Coast Guard. Green said, "The governor personally knew Dennis Washington, and I'm sure it was a joint decision because then Washington Corporation would lose all control of the costs." Murphy, "The Coast Guard strike team was very forceful that they were the experts on ISC, the Incident Command System." Green laughed. "We even pulled out cards and compared qualifications, and Montana had much higher ones than they did," Green claimed. Murphy, "The individual from EPA, who really couldn't speak very good English, which was a challenge, it finally got to the point on day 2 that we went back to the governor and said, 'You've got to get rid of this guy.'" Nguyen spoke in a thick Vietnamese accent. Murphy, "And so magically by the next morning he was gone, and we got a much more user-friendly person from the EPA that wanted to help where it was needed, but was also, if I don't feel comfortable, locals, that you're managing this, I can take it over. But as long as you're doing okay in my eyes, I'm here to help you. I'll get whatever help you need." And that worked out great, Murphy said. As a matter of fact, Scott Waldron and him, OSC Steve Way, became personal good friends and went fishing together. Green, "It's not like the EPA was just pushed out of the scene. They've got an on-scene coordinator who's running things out there at the train cars. The EPA is still directly and heavily involved. They're just not running the show." Murphy, "That first officer from the EPA, Tien Nguyen, all what he wanted to do on the organization chart on the board out there at Frenchtown Fire is, he wanted to be in the box above the IC box, and he kept trying to poke his finger through the whiteboard. So," Green laughed as Murphy poked the air. But Murphy established that Governor Roscoe's directive not to let the feds take over came before and irrespective of Nguyen's arrival on scene and any personality conflict. And if Nguyen became assertive in pushing his statutory authority, it came as a reaction to outright denial of the EPA to simply visit the site and do their job. Nguyen, in fact, had exhibited great patience. While OSC Nguyen had tried to work with Green of Montana DES to get Waldron to give Nguyen access, He had no inkling that Green was working against him. At the same time, as the text noted, EPA personnel have been at the 9 Mile command post asking questions, and Tim Murphy had warned Incident Command the EPA could be political. Murphy emphasized a perceived quid pro quo, or perhaps just granting of a favor, wherein Roscoe denied the feds, while Washington Corporation, Murphy said, stepped up and said, we're responsible and we'll pay for this. If they had not, we might have had to use the EPA to get them to pay for a lot of things. Just think what went on in that fight in the conversation between Dennis Washington and the governor, Murphy said. Talk about leadership. I mean, they sorted that out pretty quick. Whatever transpired in this conversation, Washington did nothing special by offering to pay. MRL was obligated to pay and ultimately would be made to pay by the EPA if they hadn't stepped up. The EPA, with oversight, even encouraged the responsible party to use their own resources. Washington simply had to communicate with the EPA. Green added, one of the big issues was that the state supported local government's desire to remain in control and not have it be taken over by the federal government. If denying the feds meshed with state and local desire to retain control, i.e. Waldron's control, it would make Washington's request of Roscoe all that much easier for the governor to grant. State and county locals might willingly help MRL deny the feds to ensure their own sense of control. But the real control lay with MRL. Washington was missing in action during the spill response, making no public appearances or media statements. The public knew nothing about the alleged tete-a-tete between Washington and the governor, or the confirmed denial of the feds. Murphy and Green claimed Roscoe told them, don't let the feds take this over. Their logical operative was Incident Commander Waldron, though Waldron offered no mention of the governor's order in explaining his denial of the feds. And so, as the EPA later noted, locals denied access to the EPA and the state did not request EPA involvement. Yet, EPA involvement could not be put off indefinitely. To an outsider, it appeared that MRL wanted to buy time. After not sharing the spill location with Missoula Hazmat early on April 11, MRL maintained site control for 3 days. Arguably, the most valuable thing at the site was a shattered piece of steel. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. On day 4 of the spill, the EPA finally has access to the spill site, in what becomes a day of disturbing new discoveries. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.